Hey you guys, I miss you. I just wanted to have a quick kind of conversation about Frederick Douglass and then I'm gonna move on with life. So, um, I wanted to talk a little bit about my bondage and my freedom. We had to read just one little chapter called The Last Flogging. And so there's a couple things that I want to make sure that you understand. So, number one, Douglas is living on Edward Covey's, I'm gonna say Covey's, his land right now, and basically he had been sent there by his slave master. And what Covey's kind of occupation was he was a slave breaker. I don't know if you've ever heard of that, but basically, whenever there was a slave master who had um, he had a slave that he felt wasn't like obeying him or he was just not doing what he wanted him to do, they sent them to somebody like Covey. And what Covey did was he treated them more harshly in like order to kind of break their spirit. So it was a physical breaking, but it was also kind of an emotional, spiritual breaking as well. And one of the things that my students always love about Frederick Douglass is he's really, really smart. And he's kind of snarky and he's just probably in most rooms he would be the most educated person in the room. And so people didn't like that. And he even wrote about this in his piece that people didn't like his intelligence. And so that's one of the reasons that he was as unpopular as he was. So I do want to talk a little bit about how this was a little bit of a break from some of the earlier readings. So one of the earlier readings that I had read from Frederick Douglass in the same My Bondage and My Freedom, the same book, it was an earlier chapter. Douglass is seen as pretty ambivalent about his whole life. Like he never knew who his mom was. He met her maybe once. His father was probably a slave master, his mother's slave master, and so he just really he wrote himself as very kind of not caring about his life. And so we had already seen kind of this psychological breaking of a human, which is bad. And then compared to somebody like Equiana, who just doesn't know what's going on at all, Harriet Jacobs, who seems like such a fighter in her pieces. I mean, that this woman would hide herself in this tiny little space. It was like the size of my living room table. It's amazing. And so this is a great departure from that ambivalent Frederick Douglass that we saw in earlier chapters to somebody who really was like, okay, and I'm going to stand up for myself. And when he did stand up for himself, he got his masculinity back and he saw himself as a man. But I'm getting ahead of myself. So, a couple little things that we want to talk about. There's a few things that really, really bother Frederick Douglass in this chapter specifically. Christianity is a big one. And so, one of the things that we look at is Covey's Christianity. So, basically, what had happened was Covey beat Frederick Douglass, and Frederick Douglass returned back to his actual slave master, and the master said, no, you have to go back to this guy. So he was like, I don't want to do that. He went back for a second, but things didn't turn out well, and that's when he ran away and met up with Sandy. Okay, and so he meets up with this wonderful guy, Sandy, who feeds him and takes care of him and kind of just like gives him the energy to go on. And he also gives him the magic root. I think that's an interesting piece, and I feel like we don't really get enough answers about that root by the time it's over. But a couple things that are kind of interesting. Whenever Douglass finally does go back to Covey, he goes back on a Sunday. And because it's a Sunday, the slave owner doesn't punish him at all. He basically says, no, I'm not going to punish you on the Sabbath. I'm going to punish you on a Monday. And Douglass knew pretty well that that was probably what was going to happen. But he also points out the absolute hypocrisy of that. And I'll give you like a very good example of what I'm talking about. And this is on, you know how I always point out the middle of page 1232. And on the middle of page 1232, he said, and he's talking about Covey had more respect for the day than the man, for whom the day was mercifully given. He's talking about Sunday. For while he would cut and slash my body during the week, he would not hesitate on Sunday to teach me the value of my soul or the way of life and salvation. by Jesus Christ. Sorry, I was going to say of Jesus Christ, by Jesus Christ. And so he saw a lot of problems with Christianity. And then he said basically, he'll tear up my body every day but Sunday, and then Sunday he's going to tell me that I need to believe in Jesus. And Douglas was very unapproving of this. And then he also, one of the things that we see really early, he refers to Covey as snake-like. So whenever we're reading this, we kind of have to look at Covey as almost like a snake, because what Covey does is he kind of hides in fields and then goes and attacks people basically. So he calls him a snake, and some critics do think that that snake reference is a little bit pointed at the hypocrisy of Christianity and slavery. And so we also know that Frederick Douglass lost his own faith pretty much because of everything that had happened in the institution of slavery. So just kind of pay attention to, there is a lot of religion in this piece. And had we had a full class about this, I probably could go on and on and on. So there's that. And then another thing, one more little tiny thing. On page 1235, again, close to the bottom, page 1235, he says, while slaves prefer their lives with flogging to instant death, they will also find Christians enough, like unto Covey, to accommodate that preference. And I think it's really interesting because finally at this point, when he talks about Christians, he doesn't capitalize the C anymore. And I know I talk about capitalization. I do think it's important. So that's kind of interesting too. Just do with that what you will. Anyway, so beyond that, I want to talk about this kind of gratuitous fight scene. And if you look at this, it just seemed like it went on and on, or to me. And I've always been somebody, when I watch action movies, I'm like, oh, well, they get it over with. And I feel like that was kind of the thing that I read here. I was like, wow, this is just a long, long fight. And I think there was a purpose of that. Number one, to kind of show our narrator getting his manhood back. And if we think about it, he was only 16. So I think this was a really, really important change for Douglas. And then I do think there's also important parts to the people who came in and helped Frederick. And there's basically two. And so there was Bill. And Bill was a slave who had been he was sent to work for Covey, and he was sent by his master, but he really didn't work for Covey. He worked for another master. And so that's why Bill was like, he kind of put him off. And I thought that was hilarious. That was a hilarious part. He just put him off. And then later we have Caroline, who basically she heard Covey, and Caroline was a slave her master was Covey. And so she didn't help Covey, which would have definitely been seen as insubordination, and I feel like there's a better word for that. But anyway, she did pay for that. And Caroline has a part in this story a little bit more later, but she definitely was very abused by this man, and she was abused for her part in not helping him. So, I think I just wanted to make sure that you saw those parts and kind of saw that there was some kind of loyalty with the slaves who were working with this guy. And so finally, when it was over, I love how it ends. Stupid Covey. He's like, all right, man. He totally got beat. He totally got beat up by Frederick Douglass. He was just like a 16-year-old. And I think the thing that's so interesting about that is he didn't want to hurt Frederick or kill him after that. And really, it was because of his own ego. Because he was like, well, if I tell Frederick Douglass, then I have to admit that a 16-year-old totally kicked my butt. And so I think it played out really well. As you know, and I know that it could have gone a different way, but it did work out here, and I'm really happy about that. Now, just a little tiny bit about the way the slave narrative has progressed, and I'm only talking about with our people who we read, Equiano, Jacobs, now Douglas. Probably more what we see here is maybe even a difference in education. But if you look at it, and this is just kind of a tiny little thing that I see more than anything, is it gets more sophisticated. It gets more sophisticated as it moves on. I talk about this a little bit in the Harriet Jacobs and Frederick Douglass video that I had already made a couple years ago, but it definitely gets more and more kind of intelligent, sophisticated writing, and I feel like there's nothing to blame for that except for Frederick Douglass was the smartest guy in the room always. So take with that what you will, and if you do want to find some examples of that or you want to talk about it, please let me know. You guys, I'm sorry I've been a little bit behind today. I don't even know what I'm doing. Anyway, I have a really fun lecture for Dickinson next time, and I think that's it. If you have any questions, never hesitate to ask. Bye, you guys.